I now invite to the podium the Honorable Mark Hammer, Brown County Circuit Court Judge and Business Law and Trial Advocacy Professor at St. Norbert College. Mark?
Thank you. I have the pleasure this morning of introducing our last keynote speaker for the conference, Jeff Kessler. Jeff Kessler is a senior partner and co-chairman of the international law firm of Winston Strawn. He serves on the executive committee and he chairs the antitrust and competition group. Mr. Kessler secured his undergraduate degree from Columbia University, graduating summa cum laude in 1975. Thereafter, Mr. Kessler attended Columbia Law School, where he graduated as a Kent Scholar and editor of the Law Review. Mr. Kessler has become known as one of the most prominent sports lawyers in the United States. He is regularly involved in high-profile sports litigation. Mr. Kessler has been named one of the 50 most influential people in sports business by Sports Business Journal. He's been frequently referenced as one of the 20 most influential people in the National Football League. Mr. Kessler has litigated some of the most famous sports antitrust cases in history, including the landmark antitrust jury trial, which led to the establishment of free agency in the National Football League. Mr. Kessler was lead counsel in Brady versus the National Football League, which led to the end of the 2011 NFL lockout. He was lead counsel in representing the NFL Players Association during the New Orleans Saints bounty hunter case. Mr. Kessler was successful in vacating all Saints prior discipline, which was originally imposed by Commissioner Goodell. In January of this year, Mr. Kessler appeared on 60 Minutes Sports to discuss Jenkins versus the NCAA, a landmark antitrust lawsuit filed against the NCAA by its 5 powerhouse conferences, by a group of current and former college athletes who sought to strike down unlawful compensation restraints imposed by the NCAA on Division I men's basketball and football programs. In the 60 Minutes interview, Mr. Kessler observed that he'd been looking at the NCAA and its issues for the last 2 decades. He noted that money just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and it's gotten to a point that I think any fair-minded observer looks at it and says, this system has to change. Most recently, Mr. Kessler was recognized in Forbes magazine as one of the most powerful people in college sports. The article went on to reference Mr. Kessler as a celebrated sports lawyer, considered by many to be the most disruptive man in college sports. Referencing college athletics, the article noted that Mr. Kessler had filed suit against the NCAA that would forever change college athletics as we know it. In addition to his extremely distinguished law practice, Mr. Kessler is an instructor at Columbia Law School and an adjunct professor at Fordham Law School. He regularly teaches courses on complex litigation, antitrust, sports law, and related topics. It is my pleasure today to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Mr. Jeffrey Kessler.
Thank you, Mark. These rating services about how influential you are a lot of fun, but I don't know how much meaning they have. I remember back in 1989, they came out with something that said I was the 4th most influential person in the NFL, and I noted I was also the 4th most influential person in my family, which included my wife and 2 children. And I have less influence there today. We're here today to talk about the business of Division I basketball and football. And I call it a business deliberately because that's what it is. Once upon a time, and we heard this from our panelists, they were extracurricular activities for students. By the way, just like Division III is right now for all of their sports, and does very well in that regard, and as is much of Division I outside of basketball and football. So the question is, what is the reality we face, and what is the fair and proper way to treat the athletes who are working in this business. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, and then I'll talk a little bit about how the lawsuit that I'm involved in is trying to change all of that. So I call this talk, Let Them Eat Pizza. So why do I say that? Well, there was an incident a few years ago that you may remember that involved the NCAA tournament. And at that time, Shabazz Napier, who was the point guard for the University of Connecticut, was interviewed just prior to the tournament and was surrounded by all the NCAA logos and sponsors and everything else. And what he pointed out is that he went to bed hungry at night. Okay? And this was not, by the way, an uncommon phenomenon for Division I men's basketball players or football players. By the way, some of them eat a lot. And what would happen is the NCAA was so regulated on what they could do for these athletes that after their training table was finished at dinner time, that was it. So if they got hungry at 10 o'clock at night and didn't have $1 in their pocket, which some of them don't have $1 in their pocket, they went hungry. And he couldn't go out and get a slice of pizza. That's what he was talking about. Would anybody think that's a fair system? Would anyone think that's the system that you should want for how these athletes are treated? No, I don't think so. And in fact, when I do these programs today, it is very hard to find anybody from the NCAA, from the schools, from the athletes who like the current system. Everybody disagrees what the system should be and can come up, well, we should do this or do that or not have this, but no one seems to be able to justify what the system has become. Okay, so in my view, it's going to change, and the question is how. Now, in response to the publicity that Napier received for his comments, the NCAA actually votes. They vote to allow the schools to feed the athletes, additionally, beyond that. And by the way, prior to that moment in history, the NCAA had contended, like they do about all their rules, that if you allowed such a thing, they would become professionals, and no one will watch the game, and it'll be the end of college athletics as we know it for D1 basketball and football. And of course, no one even pays attention to this except that now the athletes can eat. Okay? This is the type of progress that we're trying to make on behalf of the athletes as we pursue this. So first, let's talk about what the business is and what the NCAA claims it is. The NCAA first has in their basic constitutional article, section 2.9, which says student athletes shall be amateurs. And the purpose of this is the last sentence, they say. Student participation in intercollegiate athletics is an avocation, and student athletes should be protected from exploitation by professional and commercial enterprises. Well, how about exploitation by the schools and the NCAA? I mean, I don't quite understand their definition of exploitation. Okay, they get these athletes, they're forbidden from making choices about how to take care of them, and the athletes generate hundreds of millions of dollars. Isn't that exploitation? So the whole kind of premise of what they're saying, to me, I just don't see it. I don't know any fair-minded person could look at this objective and say that these athletes are not currently being exploited in some way, and these rules don't protect them, they restrict them. Now, the way they define amateurism is in bylaw 12, 13, and 15, which says that it's you're not an amateur if you get anything beyond the value of a full scholarship. This is an interesting notion, too. As was pointed out by one of the panelists, you're already compensating them to some degree with the full scholarship. So what is the ideological difference between compensating them at X and compensating them at a little bit more than X? I don't see how that makes you into an amateur or not an amateur in terms of all this. And in fact, because of a case called O'Bannon that we're going to talk about, and it was mentioned, it used to be that they couldn't even give you the full cost of attending the school, but now they can. So now the athletes do get a check for a couple of $1,000s to make up the difference. Did they suddenly become non-amateurs? Did they suddenly destroy the sport as we know it because that happened? By the way, that's what the NCAA said would happen in the O'Bannon case. Their defense was it was going to kill the sport and they wouldn't be amateurs and we couldn't do that. And they lost on that issue. So, again, this whole idea of protecting from exploitation and that there's some holy grail for defining amateur just doesn't jive, in my view, with what the reality is of that. Now, while the D1 athletes can't get paid from their labor, everybody else can. And I start out by looking at Jay Bilas, who's an ESPN college basketball analyst and is actually very, very, very savvy about this. And he points out that the only class of people that have any financial restrictions on them at all is the athletes. Okay, they can't go out, okay, and promote themselves, go into a business, do something. Everybody else can. No one cared if Jodie Foster went to Yale and she continued to make movies and sell her image and do other things. That didn't destroy the school as we know it. Only the athletes suffer these types of restrictions. And, you know, I look at the quote from President Machen, who was the president of the University of Florida for a number of years. And what he points out is that we have done nothing for the athletes, essentially, in the last 20 years. They've taken care of the coaches, they've taken care of the facilities, but nothing for the athletes. And by the way, that's all true. What happens is these schools, these businesses, are literally making so much money that they have nothing to spend it on. So what does that do? It is created, and we'll talk about this, hugely overpaid coaches, okay, athletic directors who are making millions of dollars, facilities that are better than some of the facilities in the pros. Okay, the players' lounge in some of these campuses are better than what you have here in Green Bay, in this institution. And why? Because they have to spend the money somewhere. They're nonprofits, okay? And it's going to stay in the athletic department. And the question becomes, shouldn't any of that, okay, go to the athletes? Let's look a little bit about where this money goes. So look at the business side here now, and we're going to talk about the power conferences who dominate this. So ESPN paid $5.64 billion, with a B, over 12 years to televise the college football playoff. It spends another $220 million annually for the bowl games, okay? In addition to that, the power conference schools received $1.1 billion for their regular season football games, and by the way, they'll receive more this year. These numbers are already outdated, okay? So you add up all of those billions of dollars. Now, how about the media rights agreements, okay? The most recent media rights agreements to the power conferences, football and basketball, paid out a total of $13.8 billion. CBS and Turner Sport paid $11 billion to broadcast the NCAA tournament over 11 years, and recently they renegotiated that deal, not only to increase the amounts paid, but to increase it before the current deal expires. They're actually they didn't have to pay more. They paid more now in order to extend the deal even further. The revenue growth is really staggering, okay? And, today, at least a dozen football games are available on live television every Saturday, sorry, this is all college, okay? And the power conferences mostly have their own cable TV networks. They literally are in the business of running their own. There's the Big Ten Network, as some of you probably get, the Big Ten Network. Well, okay, that's just being in the television business. Tell me what that has to do with the mission to educate the athletes. Okay, who do you think they hire to run the Big Ten TV network? Television executives. They're not the faculties not running the Big Ten network. This is just a business, and the schools have chosen to go into these businesses, which is perfectly fine. But if you're going to make that choice, you shouldn't have free labor as a result. And one of the things I wanted to make clear, there was some discussion on the panel about the pro athletes. This isn't really about the pros. It's not about the 1%, it's about the 99%, to use a common political phrase. Okay, 99% of the Division I basketball and football players will never spend a day in the pros. They will get nothing out of what they have contributed to this financial enterprise, at least in the form of compensation, and a very large number of them, far too many, won't even graduate with a degree, if you think that's their compensation for doing this. So for those athletes, many of whom come from impoverished backgrounds, okay, in that 99%, okay, what's wrong with doing something for them? If the schools want to, and again, I want to come back to, this is all about giving the schools and the conferences a choice as to what to do. So, more on the big business and the NCAA. So this is just an example of some of the Final Four sponsors. All of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with this. This is a list of their sponsors and where it's going from 2013 to 14. This is old data. If I had 15 and 16, you would see bigger numbers here. But you'll see from 13 to 14. If you look from 13 to 14, Capital One, who spent the most on sponsorship, went from $18 million to almost $28 million, a 48% increase in how much they gave to the NCAA tournament to be the sponsors. And it's amazing how much the NCAA tournament sells. Some of these I actually didn't know about. So, for example, did you know that Werner was the official stepladder company of the NCAA championship tournament, and they have to use Werner stepladders when they go up to cut the net after a victory? Did you know that Fiskars is the official scissor? So they pay for the right to be the scissor that's utilized at the NCAA tournament. Now, this is all about the athletes, right? That's why they do this. Okay, where is the disconnect between the NCAA's mission statement and their whole objective to prevent the exploitation of the athletes when you look at how this is really done in terms of that? Now, how they enforce these agreements are amazing too. This was one of my favorites that came out a few years ago for a Wall Street Journal reporter named Jason Gray bought a cat mug to one of the press conferences at the NCAA tournament, and they seized his mug. Why? Because he didn't have a properly sponsor-logoed mug. And the only thing you were allowed to have in view of any of the television networks was going to be a sponsored mug. I don't think he ever got his mug back, okay? And the whole point here is, again, the obsessiveness of this commercial exploitation. Jay Bilas had this incident where he went on the NCAA's website and he plugged in his athlete's name. And lo and behold, he found when you put in the athlete's name on the website, you got the jersey and the number, and say, okay, here's the jersey and number for this athlete. And he pointed out that this was fundamentally inconsistent with what the NCAA was saying was its policies. Then somebody went in and stopped it. They actually took down the feature on the site in the middle of all this, but only because it was discovered, not because of some desire to protect the exploitation of the athletes. If you look at the individual power conferences, again, just some funny money numbers. So Pac-12 made $374 million during the 2013 to 14 fiscal year. Okay, the Southeastern Conference will distribute $436.8 million. This was in May of 2015. Okay, the ACC set a record for high revenue in 14 of $302 million. The Big Ten needs to catch up, had $339 million. It's falling behind the Pac-12. And the Big 12 had almost $268 million. Now, this is just money that goes to the conferences directly, which they then distribute to the schools. This doesn't count all the money that the schools earn themselves individually. And it doesn't count anything except what flows through the conferences, and the numbers are staggering. And again, you look at their TV numbers. So the Big Ten network I mentioned has a $2.8 billion deal. Okay, $1 billion from ESPN, $145 million from Fox, okay, and $72 million from CBS in addition to the $2.8 billion that they have here. Each school gets $20.7 million each year. And by the way, that numbers would be bigger if I calculated them today. Okay, it's the same thing for all the others. $1.17 billion says, for the Big 12, $3.6 billion. For the ACC, $2.25 billion. From the SEC, $3 billion for the Pac-12. Okay, very, very large businesses. Any one of the power conferences in Green Bay would probably be the highest generating revenue company in Green Bay, Wisconsin. I'm sorry, Mark, but they'd be ahead of the Packers, at least collectively, in terms of that. And I don't know any other business in Green Bay that generates these kinds of numbers on an annual basis. They're all about licensing for the conferences as well. These are some of the logos for the different tournaments they run. They run their own championship tournaments, as you know, and they sell their own sponsors. Now, where else does this money go? So the conference commissioners, they get a lot of money, okay? The minimum for conference commissioners now is $2 million annually, and by the way, they're not educators. They have nothing to do with education. Their background is not as educators. They could be in any business, which is what the power conferences are running. As of 2014, the high was a little over $3 million, about $3.5 million. It is now higher. Pac-12, I now believe, is $4 million. And that number is for Larry Scott. That number is just going to keep going up. Okay? Then we can look at the coaches. Okay? So the average annual salary for a D1 football coach at a power conference school is more than $2 million. Okay? The top coaches make 3 times that amount. So you have Saban, for example, who at the time we did this made $7 million. Jim Harbaugh making $7 million. Urban Meyer, $5.9 million. Same in basketball. Calipari, $6.4 million. Krzyzewski, $6 million. Pitino, $6 million. Again, these are the type of salaries paid to the leaders of corporate America in many times. Why? Because these are big executives in a big corporation, and there's no place else to spend the money, which is what I'm going to come back to, which I think has actually inflated all of this. This is what I call fun facts. So they earn more than the university presidents by gigantic amounts. So poor Stuart Bell, the president of Alabama, okay, makes less than 1/10 of what Coach Saban makes. Who do you think has more influence on that campus? Okay, pick your favorite school. Okay, you have Michigan, okay, earns about 1/10 of what the football coach makes. You can go on and on in terms of this at the power schools. These numbers are extraordinary. Here's another fun fact. D1 football and basketball coaches are the best paid public employees in most states of this country. The only place that is not true is in those few states that don't have a power conference school. If you have a power conference school, your coach is the highest paid state employee. So for these purposes, the blue is where it's not coaches. The orange are football coaches, and the yellowish orange is football coaches, and the deeper orange are the basketball coaches, where they are the highest paid state employees. 28 schools last year reported revenues of over $100 million in their athletic department, all basically from D1 basketball and football. Okay? That's on an individual school basis, $100 million. If I had the figures for 15, which I don't have yet, these were the figures for 14, the number would be bigger than 28. It's going to continue to grow. The athletic directors, as I mentioned, okay, all earn more than $1 million a year at these schools. At Vanderbilt, for some reason, the AD is earning $3.2 million. I mean, they're not even that successful a program. And again, you know, I have nothing against athletic directors. Maybe there's one in the room. But the idea that the AD is the one who is responsible for this revenue or should be paid these types of salaries when the athletes can't share it all strikes me as unjust, and I also believe illegal, as I will talk about in a little while. Look how the athletic departments are growing. And this again has to do, they have to spend the money somewhere. So from 2004 to 14, UCLA's athletic administration grew from 97 to 141 employees. The non-coach payroll is now more than 16 million in the athletic department. Why? They have to spend this money somewhere. It's not like the money is not there. In 2004, the University of Michigan had 34 athletic employees making at least $100,000. Some of the faculty at the University of Michigan might be interested in that statistic. These have become standalone businesses. 34 football teams now spend at least $1 million per year on non-coach staff on the football team. The weight coach at Iowa made more than $500,000. Tell your kids, go and become weight coaches for these teams. Why does a weight coach make more than $500,000? Because you have to spend the money somewhere, okay? They are not, by the way, spending this money on the drama program. They're not spending this money on women's crew. For those of you who think, oh, they need all this money because they got to support everything else, they keep it in the football team, in the athletic department, devoted to the sports that they are making this money from. That is the reality, not the myth of where this all goes. So they're growing so much that they've started to build, and I've alluded to this, these incredible palaces because they can't compete for athletic talent in any other way. So what do? They start building these facilities, okay? And these are some of them. So this is the University of Oregon football building, which was heavily funded. It cost $68 million. heavily funded by Nike CEO Phil Knight, who contributed a lot of this. It has a barber shop, a state-of-the-art weight room, personal electronics, coaches, Whirlpool spa, and a cafeteria modeled on Google. Okay, it's got Italian furnishing, walnut wood, okay, the same leather used in a Ferrari. Why is that where the money's going? Instead of to the athletes. A&M can't be outdone. They have the Bright football complex, which was designed to create a wow factor according to their own materials. Wow. Okay. University of Tennessee has the Anderson training facility, costs $45 million. Okay. They have an indoor football field. Okay. They have an 11,000 square foot rehabilitation and hydrotherapy room. I bet that competes pretty well with the Packers facility in terms of what's available. Okay? Clemson has the Players Village. University of Michigan has the Player Development Center. University of Kentucky has the Wildcat Coal Lodge. Okay, this is a dorm built just for the men's basketball team. I want to talk about this for a second. So one of the arguments the NCAA utilizes is that they can't let students be compensated because they want to integrate the students with the athletes. They want the athletes to be part of the normal life experience. So how do they do that? They build them a segregated dormitory that's just going to be for the men's basketball team. That really integrates them into the campus and the rest of the school community. Okay? These are all just myths in terms of what these rules are about. Now, here's an interesting quotation from retired President Mackin, again, from the University of Florida. He said, "I just think the collegiate model doesn't hold up when you look at football and men's basketball. I don't care how hard you put lipstick on that sucker, it still is a pig." Okay? And he is correct. Now, the pig is slowly changing. But again, there's nobody who looks at this and says, this is a fair system you would design. I like cartoons. Here's one that appeared recently. It's basically talking about the hypocrisy. You know, you give $1 to the players versus all this cash coming in, and you're suspended, you're gone. You can't possibly receive that because it'll ruin our model. Let's talk a little bit about history. So the history is, they've never been amateurs, okay? I said maybe originally once they were, but you've always had these germs of this issue. So in 1909, the Syracuse University Chancellor, James Dean, spoke about the inequity used to advertise universities and solicit alumni donations for the teams. He said the colleges bribed star athletes away from other colleges, played ringers, and sold their honor for the price of gate receipts. This was 1909 in terms of that. In the mid-20th century point-shaming investigation, there was a New York Court of General Sessions investigation and case, and concluded that commercialism in college football and basketball was rampant, that they are no longer amateur sports, but rather sports where the athletes are bought and paid for. Recruiting violations were almost universal, and academic standards were skirted. This was in the 1950s when this came out. So again, imagine the revenues since then have grown by more than 20 times, okay, in these businesses. Now, the NCAA actually invented the concept of amateurism to protect its business model. Actually, we spoke about workers' compensation. It was designed to prevent the schools from paying workers' comp benefits to the athletes when they got injured and therefore could not continue their career. We spoke about that. Someone hurts themselves in the program, they never could become an athlete and maybe not have other types of work as well if they're hurt severely enough. And so how do I know this? Well, because Walter Byers who was the NCAA executive director from 51 to 87. In his later life, he had an epiphany, and he decided that he felt enormously guilty for what the NCAA had done, and he sort of came clean in terms of this. So he wrote a book in 1995 called Unsportsmanlike Conduct, and it was all about the true history of the NCAA. And what he wrote about is the term was crafted, student-athlete, as a substitute for words such as player and athletes in order to ward off the notion that they could be employees, and then they would get things like workers' compensation or minimum wage or something else that would be applied to someone who was an employee. He then wrote on the next part of his book that the concept of amateurism has shifted and changed over time. And he points out that the common refrain that must protect young people from commercial evils is a transparent excuse for monopoly operations that benefit others, an economic camouflage for monopoly. And this is the former executive director of the NCAA for 26 years. I mean, this was the guy. This was the guy who ran the NCAA for 26 years. One more by him. He writes, the NCAA President's Commission is firmly committed to the neo-plantation belief that the enormous proceeds from college games belong to the overseers, the administrators, and supervisors, the coaches. Taylor Branch, who is a great historian on the civil rights movement in this country, wrote a fantastic article about the exploitation of athletes in Division I basketball and football and how it resembled issues in the civil rights movement, which, by the way, is not coincidental since many of these young athletes are African American. And where some of the worst exploitation has come has been based on some of the same problems that Taylor Branch documented as an historian through that era in terms of that. The only students who can get paid, by the way, some people can be paid, okay, are people who are not D1 football and basketball players. So you may or may not know this. College tennis players can receive $10,000 per year in prize money. You know, and once enrolled, they could receive money for the cost of participating in their tournaments. Why can't the basketball players, the football players, receive any prize money or something like that? The tennis players can. Why? Because they couldn't get the tennis players to attend school if they weren't going to offer this, so they made an exception. And suddenly it's allowed. Collegiate bass fishing is allowed. The schools have teams that compete with each other nationally, and they get prizes, and no one cares if the students who are bass fishermen, male or female, by the way, get a prize, which I understand, I think the prize last year was over $10,000. Obviously, students in the military service academies who play D1 football and basketball get paid, because everybody in the military academy gets paid for being a member of the armed forces, even while they're there. No one wrings their hands and says, my God, how can Notre Dame play Navy when the Navy athletes are being paid? How are they amateurs, for God's sake? But no, that's how this restriction is imposed. Even more incredible to me. So Stanford, okay, has this entrepreneurship program that gives the students money, okay, for the best business ideas. Last year, the program gave out $100,000, including $25,000 to the first place students. The world did not fall apart at Stanford because these students were getting a little bit of money. Editors and writers at student newspapers get paid today. I didn't know that. Okay, the Stanford Daily paid out more than $350,000 in salaries to their student newspapers and publications in 2009, and paid 3 members of its boards $44,000, $40,000, and $20,000 for running that business. Why? Because the theory is you're working for the university, and they were generating revenues, and it was taking away from their ability to work at something else, so they allowed them to be paid. Officers in student government can make money. Okay, the University of Arizona, for example, pays its student president $5,000 a year. Now, people in the NCAA know this system is unfair. Look at what the athletic director of Notre Dame said. He's talking a lot about Notre Dame. He says, if our standard had been, what's the rule for other students? The musician at school doesn't have that limitation. I'm not sure why the student athlete should either. I don't find it inconsistent at all to say we need to get ourselves grounded back in that. I think it would contribute to reducing so many of the problems we have, which really spring from this situation we've created when we say they're not going to be the same as other students. That's from Notre Dame's AD. Here's from Steve Spurrier, the former football coach of South Carolina. He says, as the commissioners and the presidents and the athletic directors all say, we are going to make a whole lot more money. My question is, when are we going to start giving a little bit of it to the performers, football and basketball players? It won't do any good probably, but I'm going to still keep yelling for them. They bring in an awful lot of money for all of us. So what have we tried to do to change this? There have been a lot of efforts. We spoke about the unionization effort at Northwestern, which I think is most significant for its fact findings, which remain unchallenged. The fact findings were, to go to your previous panel, that the players there were working about 70 hours a week during the season, that they were actively told by their coaches, and this is at Northwestern, by the way, which is an academically oriented institution compared to some members of D1. The students were told and discouraged, don't go for pre-med, don't go for courses that are in any way going to distract you from your commitment to the football team, which is first and foremost. You want to do another extracurricular activity? None of it's going to interfere with the team. This is your priority. This is your job. That's what the findings were factually at Northwestern, one of the great academic institutions in this country, about their D1 football team. Do we really think it is any better at other institutions in terms of that? So the first case that was brought recently about this, there have actually been many cases brought about this, was the O'Bannon case, and that's a picture of Ed O'Bannon. Okay, by the way, Ed O'Bannon never made it as a pro. He's a good example of what we're talking about here. This is not about those who have had successful pro careers. Okay? Much less concerned about those athletes. So in the O'Bannon case, it was a class of former athletes sued the NCAA, and they went after the fact that they couldn't receive any compensation for their names, images, and likenesses in media broadcasts and video games. The district court had a trial and ruled in favor of the plaintiffs and found that this was an illegal restraint of trade under our antitrust laws. Why? Because the antitrust laws basically say competitors can't get together and fix prices or wages, okay? If two automobile companies got together and said, let's only pay our employees $10,000 a year, and that's it, because it'll save us all money, and we can pay more to the supervisors and the president and others who are working here, and we can invest in our facilities, basically they would go to jail, okay? That is a legal activity. And so the answer is it also an antitrust violation, okay, for the schools to get together through the NCAA and say, no one's going to pay more than the cost of attendance scholarship. And in the time of O'Bannon, it wasn't even the full cost of attendance. So this was struck down, okay? And why did the court strike it down, Judge Wilkin? Well, first of all, if you look at the bottom paragraph, she rejected the amateurism defense for several reasons. First of all, she said the argument mischaracterizes the commercial nature of the transactions between FBS football and Division I basketball school and their recruits. So one of the panelists was talking about goods and services are exchanged. That's what she was talking about. And the district court next found that the NCAA has revised its rules regarding compensation numerous times, where originally they didn't allow scholarships even. They said you can't give them scholarships because that would make them non-amateurs. Then they said, okay, you can give them scholarships. Okay, and so there was no consistency to this idea of it being a core principle. Instead, the definition has been malleable, as the court found. It was less a core value than something they were doing for their own purposes. Now, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed the district court's ruling that it was illegal. Okay, but so basically, on liability, on it being wrong, the players won. However, it was a mixed decision because the judges of the Court of Appeals, 2-1, said, well, it's illegal, but we will allow you to enjoin the schools from not paying the cost of attendance, but we're not going to let you have an injunction that says they each have to pay $5,000 a year into a trust fund for the names and likenesses. So the NCAA won in part on the remedy. They lost on liability. What happened? Okay, right now, both sides are appealing to the Supreme Court. We don't know if the Supreme Court will take it. It's very unusual. The NCAA is appealing because they lost. And they don't like the fact that the court ruled that their rules are subject to antitrust laws and were illegal. The players are appealing because they thought the part of the opinion that didn't allow the full relief granted by the court was legally improper. So we'll see if the Supreme Court takes that or not. Supreme Court doesn't take a lot of cases, but this is an interesting one. If they do, obviously, that will have a profound effect on what the state of the law is going to be. Now, our case is a little bit different. I am the counsel in a case called Jenkins versus the NCAA, and also in a case called the Grant and Aid antitrust litigation. It's all been merged together. This is a class action case that I brought on behalf of football and D1 football and basketball players, and I'm trying to just get an injunction in Jenkins, not damages, that will free the schools to make their own decisions. So if a school wants to set up a trust fund for the athletes so that each year as they progress towards graduation, they get some money put in that fund. And then if they graduate, they get a little money. And at the end of the time, if someone goes through 4 or 5 years and gets a degree and they walk away with, let's say, $100,000, because you put in $25,000 a year, maybe $125,000, you give a bonus for graduation, some small sliver of that money, instead of going to Coach Saban, will go to that poor kid on the Alabama team who's not going to be a pro, who now has been encouraged to graduate and do that. Is that what Alabama will do? I don't know. But I trust the schools to make good decisions if they're allowed to do so. Right now they are shackled. They can't choose. They can't decide what they're going to do. We're not seeking any damages in the Jenkins case. We're just seeking to free up this market so that schools can make the right decisions as to how they're going to do this. This is all, and I wrote this here, it's all about freedom of choice for the schools and the conferences. That's what we're seeking in the Jenkins case. Now, Jenkins has been joined together with the Grant and Aid case, which is seeking damages for past players on the difference between the full cost of attendance and what they previously got. Remember, O'Bannon said that was illegal, so the Grant and Aid is seeking damages for players who didn't receive the ability to get full cost of attendance. Our classes, we have class actions. They have to be certified by the court. They were certified for injunctions on December 4th of last year. Right now, we're in the middle of what we call discovery. We're getting documents and depositions and building our case going forward. Now, what are the justifications that the NCAA is arguing? Well, first they argue amateurism, and I think I've already covered it. There's no evidence that anybody who watches college sports, who cares about it, would care if a little of this money was paid to the athletes in an equal way in a decision by the schools. Okay? If you're a Notre Dame fan, you are not going to watch one less game if the coach made a little less, if the facility was a little bit less, if the AD made a little less, if the weight coach made a little less, and each of those athletes equally got some bonus from the school to help them with their lives going forward when they're not going to be pros after they contributed to that organization. And we know this through a variety of things. So I mentioned that after O'Bannon, they allowed the schools to provide higher value scholarships. So then now the schools are now giving a little bit more money to the athletes. Does anybody care? Has that done anything to affect the revenues of the sport? Has that done anything except make the lives of these athletes a little bit better in a fairer way? The Olympics is an example I love to use. It used to be you couldn't have professionals in the Olympics. And the prediction was no one will watch the Olympics if they're professionals. So what happened? Okay, after 1988, they allowed professionals. It exploded in TV ratings. It exploded in interest. It was fairer for the athletes. The track athletes, for example, are now able to get sponsors and others to pay for their livelihood as they're going through this. There is absolutely no reason why. And if you look, I love this quote that says, allowing Usain Bolt and Michael Phelps to sell shoes and sandwiches has benefited everyone. Athletes, especially in developing nations, stop being forced to live in poverty. Again, I don't care about Michael Phelps and Usain Bolt. They're going to do fine. It's the 99%. We're trying to help those athletes who are living in poverty, who don't get anything out of this system. They also argue competitive balance as a justification. Competitive balance doesn't work in D1 football, basketball as a justification because there's no balance. Hey, does anyone think the University of Delaware competes with the universities of Delaware and Texas for the same athletes? Does anyone think they're balanced? Okay, the same programs, power conferences, schools dominate in these sports year in and year out in both basketball and football. Okay, there's no balance to preserve, and the reason is their resources are vastly different. So right now, if you are a top athlete, it says you're going to Duke, you're not going to a unknown Division I basketball program. Now, some of you can say, wait a minute, though. In that NCAA tournament, it says we always have these upsets and things. Isn't that balance? No, that's random events. So what happens is that school, who is this little tiny school who could, is a school who got athletes that Duke didn't want. I can assure you, it's not because they were able to attract the athletes from Duke. And they happen to miss some good players, and they may stay there for more years and play together as a team, as a coach, and in that environment, they can have a couple of upsets in the NCAA tournament, which is a lot of fun, but it has nothing to do with balance. And by the way, okay, none of those teams ever win the NCAA tournament. You could look it up. Okay, when you see who finally, at the end of the day, after these upsets, end up. So it's not about preserving balance. There just isn't anything there. If anything, I could argue, if you allowed some of these teams to offer better benefits to the athletes, whether it's health benefits or other things that were creative, they might attract somebody from some of the bigger programs, but they can't compete with the prestige. They can't do in that. But again, it just is not a justification that works, and the courts have rejected it. Integration as a justification, academic integration, I've already spoken about. They don't try to integrate the athletes. In fact, some of the schools are terrible at it. We spoke, though, about Northwestern, about how hard the commitments are to the athletes. They are not encouraged to be integrated. with the rest of the population. It'd be a very nice thing, but that's not a justification for what they're doing here. At some schools like North Carolina, you now have scandals where the athletes are being steered to courses that weren't even real courses. And there's now a class action lawsuit being sued that they didn't get an education because that was not the intent. The intent was to keep them eligible, not to educate them. Okay, so how could you justify these restrictions in terms of that? And I also notice no one worries about integration of others on the campus who earn money. I can go back to the entrepreneurs, to the musicians, to the actors, to the others who could earn some money. And that doesn't prevent their integration. Why is it only the athletes? And again, what our answer is, if we were to prevail, is that the conferences and the schools would have freedom of choice. Some conferences might not allow it. That's okay. That's their decision. But some may. Some may decide to provide, and these are just some possibilities, incentive education bonuses for each semester of academic progress. I mentioned that. Put deferred payments into a trust, an annuity program. Offer bonuses for academic honors. They can't do that in terms of that. They could offer scholarships to complete bachelor degrees or graduate degrees or vocational degrees. Some of them won't be for college degrees at a later time. They could have health savings accounts. You know, so much of it we read about in football with the concussion issue and the head injury issue, and by the way, it could be an issue in the other sports as well. What would be wrong with allowing these schools to take some of that money from the coaches and saying, I'm going to cover you if 15 years from now you end up with dementia? Would that be a bad thing? Would you stop watching the sports if the NCAA allowed for that? All of this could be done, okay, if you just would free up the schools to make choices. So, in conclusion, we think the time for change is now. Okay, we think it's going to happen. I don't know if it's going to happen in 2 years, in 3 years, in 5 years, but we think it's going to happen. And the only question is how. Okay, it can happen in a way that's positive for all the stakeholders. It can happen in a disruptive way, but it needs to happen because this system is something we should be ashamed of at these schools. And that's not right. If I was a university president, I wouldn't think it's right that this is how we treat these athletes who generate all these revenues. These businesses that they run should not be able to continue exploiting free labor. We think the antitrust laws are the answer. We think we could work this out in a settlement if the schools would sit down with the class and come up with a system. But otherwise, we'll let the courts decide. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate that. Let me ask some questions at this point. Anybody? Yes?
Yeah, if there's an antitrust exemption for some professional sports, do you think that someone might lobby Congress to establish an antitrust exemption for the NCAA?
Well, Congress has never granted an antitrust exemption for the labor markets and in the sports. If you're unionized and you have a union, you get out of the labor laws an exemption for your collective bargaining agreement. But you're otherwise not protected. A million years ago, the Supreme Court ruled baseball wasn't subject to antitrust, but that actually got reversed by Congress in the labor markets in a statute called the Kirk-Flood Act. So now antitrust applies to labor even in baseball in terms of that. So no, I don't think Congress would have any appetite for creating a labor market exemption for the NCAA if they sought it. And if they did, they would probably put in so many regulations for what they wanted the schools to do in exchange that I'm not sure the NCAA really wants to go down that road in terms of that. Yeah.
If you were to allow, let's say, a completely free market for labor for college athletes, we wind up in a situation almost certainly where the foreseeable future women would be paid on average much less. You'd have some making a pile of money, and then you'd have the supporting cast. On the other hand, the other extreme is that if you mandate that everybody money
Right.
for the program. How do you work through those two?
Well, I don't think any of that's true, okay? Because you're assuming as if the choice is between the current system and some textbook model of perfect competition, which is not the world we live in. So, for example, we have Title IX, okay? Title IX requires that there be equal opportunities to women. So guess what? That's going to be a constraint on how much they could pay to the men, which is okay. That's a judgment we made as a country. It will limit what you could do. So no, I don't think there's going to be a huge variation between the men and women, certainly not in the revenue sports in terms of that. Second, okay, right now there's a huge disparity between what they spend on men's and women's sport. Have you seen the football stadiums? Okay, is there anything like that for the women athletes? Okay, this will only help women derivatively if you can free up the market. Number two is that the antitrust laws allow reasonable restrictions. It doesn't require pure competition. So, for example, one of the points that was made, if a school thought it was going to divide the team, okay, to allow there to be stars paid more than others, a school can say, I'm going to pour away some money for everybody, so that the offensive tackle, who may be more valuable than the running back, okay, in some ways, okay, gets the same as the running back. And the bench player who works just as hard gets the same as there. There's no requirement that it be there. And those type of restrictions, if adopted by an individual school, are going to be legal because there's no agreement. And if it's even adopted with a conference without market power, it's probably going to be legal. So again, the NCAA likes to pose this bogeyman that this is about making the college market look like the professional sports market. It's not. No one's saying that the NCAA, I mean, one of the things they said is we'll give fewer college scholarships if we do this. I said, okay. They have current rules requiring a minimum of college scholarships. No one's challenging those rules. No one's telling them to get rid of those rules. So again, it's a false dichotomy to look at it that the debate is between, a textbook market with no regulations or restraints at all versus what would likely develop if we won the case in terms of that. Yes, other questions? Yeah.
Given the economic circumstances you shared with us with the Power 5 conferences, my question is twofold. Then why would any of the Division I schools outside the Power 5 plus Division II and Division III remain in the NCAA? And conversely, why haven't the Power 5 conferences let the NCAA to form their own organization?
Well, that could happen. You could end up with a Division 1A, which are schools that are in this business model, and those who choose not to be. The president of Notre Dame spoke about that. He said he could see a world where some schools are devoted to the TV networks and the business and all of that, and they're in one kind of model, and it's there. They all could still be part of the NCAA, just like Division II and Division III is now. There's no relationship between being a Division III school in sports and being a Division I, but they're all there because they still agree on the same rules of the game, and they do provide some revenue sharing from the NCAA tournament to support. It's very small little amount, but they do provide a little bit of revenue sharing to the other divisions. None of that has to change in terms of that, but you're right, there could be a Division I school, and you really sort of have that now. Okay, look at the Ivy League. The Ivy League doesn't give scholarships, doesn't give sports scholarships, still gives scholarships, and frankly, it usually has the same impact. But at least they say they don't allow athletic scholarships, okay, and yet they're part of Division I. No one seems to think that's odd in terms of that, yes.
Courts have been defending this notion that money is speech, especially in the U.S. I'm wondering, as a booster, if I would want to speak, not just by yelling at a game, but by giving $5,000 to the Pizza Club for the NCAA players live. How can anybody restrict me? I mean, I can't be restricted in giving all sorts of money to political campaigns. Why not to have?
Well, the courts just have not viewed it that way, at least up until now. They've ruled that spending money for political speech can't be restricted. There are lots of restrictions on commercial use of money, for example, commercial bribery. You can't go to somebody who's your customer and bribe them to buy from you, bribe an individual and say that it's speech. So I don't know that the courts will extend it that way, but I see the logic of your argument. I'm not sure, by the way, I agree with the rulings that they're speech, but I understand what you're saying in terms of it's a slippery slope, but at least so far, the courts have distinguished spending on campaigns from other kinds of speech.
Are there any inroads for working the boosters, making a channel so that boosters can
Yeah.
make money on activities?
That is at least not what's been my focus. My focus has been letting the schools do their own thing. I suppose indirectly the schools could raise money from the boosters to the schools, not the athletes. So if you're going to, and that's happened in cost of attendance. Some of the schools I know, for example, Connecticut for basketball, they wanted to pay full cost of attendance. They went to their alumni and said, would you establish a fund now that it's allowed to allow us to pay full cost of attendance? And that's permitted. They got alumni donations, their former coaches contributed, they got a fund, and they were able to pay full cost of attendance raised that way. That's how they decided to do it. So I think that's more likely how you'd see the boosters participate, which is a much better way. No one's advocating let the boosters work directly with the athletes. That's a whole different issue. It has to do much more, frankly, with concerns about corruption and gambling and other things than anything else, than it would be if the schools paid it. Yes, anything else? I think one more maybe?
One more question. Is there one more question from the audience? Well, if not,
Okay, well, thank you very much.
well, we're about at the end of the formal aspects of our program for the 2016 Sport and Society Conference. We'd like to thank St. Norbert College and the Green Bay Packers for hosting the conference. Let's see, are going to move forward here for some of the remaining events that includes the tour of Lambeau Field and the Hall of Fame. For those of you who are signed up for the tour, then you can pick up your tickets outside the guest relations table here at the top of the escalator, and that's also where the guide will be meeting you at the time for the tour's departure. The tour of the Hall of Fame is self-guided, so you'd be able to go on that tour at whatever time is convenient for you. The shuttle back to the Crescent on the St. Norbert College campus will begin departure here from Lambeau Field at 3 o'clock this afternoon. We're going to now take just a few minutes short break, and at 12:30 we're going to have lunch served for those individuals who are registered for the conference. The lunch is going to be in the adjacent Blood Davis room, which is to my right and your left, here in just a few minutes. And I want to thank all of you again for your participation in the conference. We gratefully appreciate the outstanding speakers and paper presentations that were given, and we hope to see all of you back in Green Bay again sometime soon. Thank you very much.